outcomes insights research, where we focus on the life experiences and patient-reported outcomes of people with chronic disease. Before I start, I'd just like to make a disclosure that this presentation, I can declare that I have no financial disclosure or conflicts of interest with the presented material in this presentation. Before starting, I'd just like to go through and outline the objectives of this presentation. In this presentation, I'm proposing an alternative approach to the current application of patient-reported outcome measures. And in doing so, I'm going to argue that the numeric score that we derive from the use of PROMs that represents the individual's health status or health-related quality of life is limited due to the illness narrative being lost along the way. When I talk about narrative, I'm talking here about the patient's actual story, their life story. Secondly, to argue the case for a patient-reported outcome measurement, which is based on a mixed method research methodology. And thirdly, to put forward narrative inquiry as a methodology to enhance the quality of the quantitative data provided by the PROM. But first, I'd like to provide just a little bit of a background to this. A patient-reported outcome measure, or acronym PROM, is any report of the status of a patient's health condition that comes directly from the patient. That's without interpretation of the patient's responses by a clinician or anybody else. Today, PROMs play a central role in clinical research and patient care, driven most likely by the need to provide more patient-centered care with an increasing use in a nursing context. Importantly, there remains, however, little discussion on the theory underpinning PROM development. And despite this, the implicit philosophical paradigm or framework underpinning their development and application is what we refer to as the nomothetic explanation. That is, establishing generalizations that apply to all people. PROMs operate within a set of assumptions about the world, which is that the standardized numerical score is the objective representation, for example, by a point on a scale of 0 to 100, of the respondent's health status and health-related quality of life. But this is independent of the context of the individual's life history. As a consequence, the day-to-day experiences of a person living with a disease or condition are reduced to a quantifiable metric score, leading to PROMs failing to provide a true picture of the individual's experience of their health status and quality of life. There is no other requirement to determine the individual health status and quality of life from the perspective of the researcher. This pursuit for objectivity forces us into a mode of scientific inquiry that impedes our ability to get the most insightful answers to our questions. To gain this insight, there is also the need to study the concrete and unique case to achieve a complete understanding and interpretation of what the patient score represents. I will return to this point later when I discuss the limitations of the PROM. Moving current development. Sorry, yeah, there we go. As already pointed out, the underlying framework underpinning their development and application is the pursuit of objectivity, which is at the expense of ignoring the patient's subjective experiences living with a condition or disease. The US Food and Drug Administration provides guidance for the development of a PROM instrument, which is a process comprising a number of stages. This includes the qualitative stage, during which content is generated through methodologies, including literature reviews, in-depth interviews, focus groups, cognitive interviews, and clinical observation. This is followed by a quantitative stage of pre-testing consisting of psychometric evaluation to establish reliability and validity. Moving to the next slide, some typical applications. These can be broadly categorized as either generic or specific. Generic measures are developed for the measurement across general health, whereas the condition-specific have been developed for specific conditions, for example, diabetes and asthma. PROMs are used across a wide range of applications, including assessing performance and determining the comparative effectiveness of different treatments, benchmarking the performance of healthcare providers, clinical practice, where monitoring conditions that rely on patients' reports rather than diagnostic tests such as depression or certain gastrointestinal disorders. So moving to the limitations of PROM application and development, I'm getting closer to the point of my argument here. I list, excuse me, my dog is barking, I'm sorry. Claire! Sorry about that. So moving on, as already alluded to, PROMs operate within a set of assumptions about the world, which is that the standardized numerical score is the objective quantitative representation of the patient's health status and health-related quality of life, resulting in the measurement of the informant's health status or quality of life being independent of the context of the individual's unique life history, where the day-to-day experience of a person living with a disease or condition are reduced to a quantifiable metric, as I've already pointed out. In addition, PROM content can have different meanings for different informants, as well as the PROM content possibly representing the researcher's world, assumptions, values, and beliefs, creating the potential for tension between the experience of the patient and the requirements of the pre-prepared items of the questionnaire. Returning to my earlier point that the nomothetic explanation is the underlying approach to PROM development, we need to understand that there are two representations of reality, or two distinct approaches to knowledge. There are the objective, or as I keep saying, the nomothetic, and the ideographic. That's the study of the individual, a unique agent with a unique life history with properties setting them apart from the individual. This dichotomy represents the two kinds of knowledge required by different interests. Based on the nomothetic approach, positivism is said to be the philosophy of measurement of philosophy, how we measure something, how we gain knowledge, underpinning outcome measurement, with its reliance on validated and reliable items and questionnaires and established population norms. Positivism asserts that knowledge should be based on the objective world via empirically verified causal explanations based on positive facts, not abstract deductions with no attempt being made to understand or interpret the meaning of things. That is, the subjective and emotive. There is no possibility of understanding the process of getting ill, being ill, getting better or worse, or addressing issues such as despair, hope, grief, which can often accompany illness. A case being PROM data collected with a positive paradigm as a requirement within the regulatory context, such as drug licensing, label claims, clinical trials, and other intervention studies. This enables the study of classes of or cohorts of individuals from which generalizations can be made. The assumption being that people have similar fixed needs, preferences, perceptions, and experiences, and will attribute the same importance to each PROM item. But when we come to wanting an explanation behind these metric representations of living with a disease or condition, for example, within the context of patient care, although we can benchmark where our patient is relative to a given population on a numeric score, it tells us nothing about the context of the patient's experience. So, what is the way ahead? As we remain dependent on self-reported data of people's behaviors, experience, health status, and quality of life, there is a need to develop and improve methods to ensure that the data collected is of a high quality. Nevertheless, there remains the need to obtain the standardized PROM score that represents the researcher's predefined constructs. Despite the limitation of a metric score giving only a one-sided picture of reality within the context of nomothetic methodology, PROMs do remain a valuable tool where improving scores, for example, represent the evidence of treatment efficacy or improved health status and or quality of life. Furthermore, the positive approach also enables a greater reach of the population under study, as the content and scoring of the PROM can be standardized despite the limitations of the information obtained. Both the nomothetic and idiographic are representations of reality, as I've already pointed out, or alternatively, two distinct approaches to understanding or gaining knowledge, with each having their own specific methodologies. While, as already stressed, the nomothetic is the key underpinning methodology for gathering information on patient-reported outcomes. In contrast, however, research have given less attention as to whether or how qualitative information should be gathered and used in a systematic way to convey patient experiences aligned with the patient's metric score. So, Neal and Strang have hypothesized that PROMs are best viewed within the philosophical tradition of pragmatism, whereby researchers should use the philosophical and or methodological approach that works best for the particular problem being researched. Pragmatism is based on the proposition that researchers should use the methodological approach that works best for the particular research problem. Tashakori and Teddy proposing that pragmatism, or the philosophy of free choice, is the most appropriate method for mixed methods research. So what is mixed methods research? Mixed methods research is a research methodology in which the investigator collects and analyzes data, integrates the findings, and draws inferences using both qualitative and quantitative approaches or methods in a single study or a program of inquiry. The overall goal of mixed methods research is combining both qualitative and quantitative research components so as to expand and strengthen a study's conclusions. So the task is combining both quantitative and qualitative research, which has been used in the development of PROMs for many years, although this is still in the early phase of PROM development. By taking a pragmatic approach and combining both methodologies, mixed method research has the potential to enhance the quality of the quantitative data, i.e. the metric scores, provided by the PROM, by enabling respondents to offer narratives or to tell a story of their experiences and perceptions. Shown here in this slide is, through a case-based mixed methodology, the integration of both the qualitative, that's the informant's narrative, and quantitative, that's the PROM scores, data is to contextualize and interpret informant's PROM scores. But what is narrative? Narrative is inquiry in the way people tell their stories. As an umbrella term, it captures personal dimensions of experience over time by using approaches including life story research, oral history, and biography. The key features of narrative inquiry are that narrative is the form or process of telling stories, while narrative refers to the unique stories of individuals which are distinct in content. Narratives are personal accounts of people's motives, experiences, and actions. Narratives do not consist just of single statements and reflections, but are lengthy accounts and reflections of the narrator, that would be the patient. Narratives are the oral expression of personal experience, and narratives can be either verbal or written. Narrative inquiry is a relatively new practice in nursing, but is used in several disciplines such as developmental psychology, social work, anthropology, and sociology. Narrative inquiry challenges the philosophy behind quantitative data gathering and questions the idea of objective data, allowing for a rich description of experience and an explanation of the meanings that participants derive from their experiences, and has been described as simply an elegant and exceptionally useful way to uncover and detail about previous experiences. Narrative inquiry is not simply storytelling, it's a method of inquiry that uses storytelling to uncover nuances. In sum, the narrative approach seeks to make a meaning of individual experiences and has the following characteristics to distinguish it from quantitative methodology. It focuses on individual stories. Understanding individual lives through individual stories is central to the process and products of narrative research. Personal nature of research process. Researchers and participants must work closely together to come to a shared understanding of the participants' stories. Because of their goal of capturing real lives as lived, research outcomes make it possible to connect understandings to the everyday world. Emphasis on subjectivity. More than other qualitative methodologies, narrative goes beyond scientific and empirical standards, relying on the authentic voices of participants to generate confidence in research findings. So narrative inquiry differs from other qualitative approaches. So what are those distinguishing features of narrative inquiry compared to qualitative research in general? Narrative is characterized mainly by its coherence and sequential form. Participants have more power as they control the story. Narrative produces coherent stories versus fractured texts. Narrative is not guided by the researcher. Narrative inquiry has been defined as a distinct qualitative approach rather than seeing it embedded with other qualitative approaches. So the power of narrative, the uniqueness of narrative inquiry can be best illustrated by this slide. Narrative is the way people tell their story. Is focused on individual stories. As already pointed out, researchers and participants work closely together to come to a sharing understanding of the participants' stories, which result in capturing real lives, making it possible to connect understanding to the everyday world, where the emphasis on subjective in contrast to the quantitative approach, which is independent of the context of the individual's unique life history. Practical orientation because of their goal of capturing real lives as lives. Research outcomes make it possible to connect understanding to the everyday world with the emphasis on subjectivity. So turning to the narrative approach of data collection, having argued the case for a multi-method research approach two fundamental questions require addressing. First, what kind of narrative best represents the evidence to inform patient-reported outcomes? And secondly, what form of analysis should the narrative undergo? Methods for capturing narrative include observation, transcripts of interviews, depth interviews, focus groups, and other semi-structured interviews, as well as reviewing diaries and letters, among other materials. However, as the focus of the story is the story behind the respondent's response to the PROM, in-depth interviews or semi-structured interviews would seem to be the most appropriate in presenting a case-based method for narrative analysis. However, it is recommended that when undertaking both qualitative and quantitative data analysis and combining them within a single study, open-ended questions designed to produce narrative can be combined with self-administered questionnaires. There's also the need to consider the cost and resources required for studies with large sample sizes, as well as the systematic reporting of the qualitative information. Development of coding schemes can be developed to categorize the narrative content. However, such an approach can eliminate the features that are the hallmarks of narrative, for example, through the distillation of detailed accounts into coding units. So the narrative approach to analysis, why there is no definitive approach to narrative analysis. Narrative inquiry is a qualitative research approach whereby the research analyses the stories people create, engaging in an inquiry of asking questions of the narrative text for a given purpose. This slide shows an approach in which interpretation of the narrative is essentially dialogic, a representation of an ongoing conversation. This approach is represented by the hermeneutic cycle shown here. Clark refers to this as a fusion of horizons. As the researcher goes around their circle of understanding, interpretation of the patient's narrative is updated, and which can be considered as a metaphor for what happens between the patient and the researcher in the understanding of the narrative. Each has their own understanding and preconceptions. And here you've got this circle of understanding. It's an iterative process. As the conversation goes on, both the researcher and the patient have a better understanding. The task for the analytical method is to help inform and contextualize patients' PROM scores. The method chosen, however, to achieve this will depend on the purpose of the inquiry. Where the investigator's objective is to understand the narrative of individuals in relation to their quantitative scores, narrative analysis enables the accumulation of detail to provide a fuller picture of the individual. Each approach, individual narratives, categories, centered methods, etc., provide a different way of knowing the phenomenon within each, providing a unique insight into the patient's everyday life. While this presentation limits a more detailed discussion on the analytical process of the narrative, it is given that narrative information is multidimensional and that its effects on the individual's experiences of their health, status, and quality of life may vary in complex ways. We therefore need a rigorous approach that helps the collection and incorporating of the patient's experience in a systematic and useful way to help decision-making. Different approaches to narrative analysis have focused on different aspects as ways to gain analytical distance. For example, our focus of analysis identification of thematic similarity in a narrative, which is in contrast to analysis of the narrative structure, where the intention is to understand the speaker's explicit purpose in telling a story. What we want to know is what the story is, not the purpose of the telling of that story. Current analysis is used to content analysis is used to determine the presence of certain words, themes, or concepts, and can be applied to either a single case narrative or a series of narratives where the researcher moves from one story to another, checking for the main features and identifying common elements. Finally, interactional analysis. Elliott describes this as an understanding of the narrative with an interactional and institutional context. So just turning to some critical issues and some considerations, there is, of course, a need to be sensitive to the fact that narrative can be biased in one form or another. Closely linked is memory of the informant. For example, we need to be aware that memory is selective and how it fits the informant's self-concept. Furthermore, narrative research places a considerable emphasis on the researcher to be self-critical and to be reflective about their work. Yet, if narratives are to play a critical role in our inquiry, we need to be confident in our judgment and evaluation of their content, and that our reasons for acceptance are open to scrutiny. Value judgment and subjectivity will clearly come into play, and as a result, stresses the rigor of our interpretation. So, looking ahead, the combination of narratives with PROM numeric scores is at an early stage, and there are a number of questions which will require addressing. These include, how should narrative be integrated with other performance metrics when reporting a patient's experience? How should narrative information be present in ways that support good decision making? How does narrative information impact on clinicians' choices? And will narrative evidence lead to support and best practice? Wang and Gill suggest that narrative inquiry in nursing research offers a particular way of caring about how knowledge is produced and the importance of the relationship between the researcher and participant. Acknowledging the researcher's subjectivity may help generate models of good practice and theories of application in the world of research, and may further good practice and its application in a clinical setting. This should also be the case in the understanding and interpretation of patients' experience in tandem with their PROM scores. So in conclusion, I'd just like to mention here, to understand the efficacy of clinical intervention requires a highest quality of information available. Where the RCTs or random controlled trials can be considered as the gold standard for this requirement, but when it comes to the assessment of patients' health status and health-related quality of life, I have argued that constrained by the straitjacket of the quantitative approach in the underpinning of its development application, the PROMs have reached their limit in the provision of information on patient experience and behavior. While acknowledging within this constraint, PROMs can be a useful tool. I have argued that narratives of first-person experience, if subjected to a high level of critical scrutiny, can be of high quality, and when used in tandem with PROM data, can provide a deeper and more insightful account of patients' experiences. In summary then, quantitative information has dominated the reporting of patient-reported outcome measurement, resulting in a lack of insight into individual informants' experiences. Informants' narrative can be elicited and organized in reliable and valid ways to present meaningful insight into patient experiences of their health status and quality of life in combination with their PROM scores. Narrative inquiry in nursing research offers a particular way of caring about how knowledge is produced and the importance of the relationship between the researcher and patient. Acknowledging the researcher's subjectivity may help generate models of good practice and theories of application in the world of research, and may further good practice and its application in a clinical setting. Nursing science would benefit from the understanding that health and nursing practices are dynamic processes characterized by the continuous interaction of human thought and behavior that continuously bumps into personal, social, and material environments. I've also shown for this presentation the slides, the references that I've alluded to in this presentation. That's the end of my presentation, and thank you very much for your time. Thank you.
Thank you, Doctor, for this informative presentation, especially the differentiation between the qualitative studies and also the narrative studies. Any questions to Dr.